I'm Alex Vissink, a historian specialized in the Viking Age. Alas, a rich land stripped of its treasures, left with bloody wounds, fully robbed, filled with grim murder, a frenzy beyond compare. The Danes ransacked and despoiled, massacred and burned and ravaged. They were an evil cohort, a deadly phalanx, a grim horde. This was written in the battles of the city of Paris, also known in Latin as the Bella Parisiacae Urbis, and it is one of the most remarkable Viking Age sources to survive from the 9th century. Like many medieval histories, it was written by someone who personally witnessed a great deal of the events it describes. The author was a monk called Abbo, and he witnessed the Great Viking Siege of Paris of 885 till 886. As you could already hear in the passage that I've just read, the account is very dramatic, it is emotional and often highly literary. In this video today, we will delve deeper into the Bella Parisiacae Urbis and explain why it remains one of our most important sources for understanding the Viking siege of Paris. So first of all, what is the Bella Parisiacae Urbis, which I will call Bella from now on? The Bella is a historical poem rather than a chronicle or an annal. It was written at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. As I've already said, the work describes the Viking siege of Paris in 885 and 886. And afterwards, it briefly continues the story into the decade afterwards, during which Odo ruled the West Frankish kingdom. Like all medieval sources, this poem must be read very critically. As could be seen in the introduction passage of this video, Abbo uses the narrative strategy of othering. In other words, he exaggerates the negative qualities of the Vikings, or simply invents them, in order to create a distinction between the good Christians and the bad Vikings. Now, among Carolingian literary works, it is quite exceptional. It is both the longest surviving poem describing a military campaign and the first major historical narrative poem written since the start of the 9th century. Now, the author, as I've mentioned, is Abbo. It remains a very mysterious figure. Almost everything we know about him comes from this particular source. He describes himself as a young monk at the Abbey in Paris of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and as a native of Neustria. Neustria roughly corresponds with what is today northern France or western France. However, the identity of Abbo was layered. As modern historian Simon MacLean has observed, Abbo presented himself simultaneously as a monk of Saint-Germain, a Parisian, a Neustrian, and a Frank. So not only did Abbo identify himself on a more closer, smaller scale, so the city, the specific area in the Frankish kingdom, but also as a Frank, he saw himself as a part of the whole kingdom. Now, when was the poem actually written? It was not written immediately after the siege. Historical evidence suggests that Abbo wrote it somewhere between 888 and 897. We know this because he referred to Odo as a king, meaning the work must have been written after Odo's coronation in 888. At the same time, Abbo never mentions Odo's death in 898, which means that he most likely wrote it before that period in time. What's also important to mention is that historians believe that the entire poem was written in several stages. An initial version may have been completed around 890, with later additions extending the narrative into the mid-890s, before finally completing the work around 897. This final date, 897, can be deduced from the fact that Abbo continues to describe events until the year of 896. Interestingly, these later editions portray Odo as less favorably than earlier sections, suggesting that Abbo's opinion or the political circumstances around him may have changed over time. Bella consists of 3 books. The first 2 describe the Viking siege. These 2 books provide a vivid account of military operations, heroic defenses, negotiations, miracles, and political decisions during the siege. The third book, however, is quite different. Rather than continuing the historical narrative, it becomes a theological work discussing virtue, sin, spiritual warfare, while also demonstrating Abbo's impressive command of language. At the same time, Abbo himself explains that it was also intended, this third book, as a literary guide for students, offering unusual Latin and Greek words to be used by aspiring writers. It is this third book that became far more popular than the historical narrative. The first 2 books survive in only 1 manuscript, and the third book has circulated widely throughout the Middle Ages. One intriguing question is, why did Abbo write this poem? Abbo never tells us who commissioned it. Some historians believe it to be King Odo who commissioned it, and others suggest it was the monastery itself, so Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Either way, the poem undoubtedly strengthens Odo's reputation, at least in the first part of the poem. Throughout much of the poem, he appears as the ideal Christian ruler, courageous, energetic, and devoted to the defense of both the city but also of Christianity. Such a portrayal would have been especially useful after Odo's election as king in 888, when he needed to legitimize his rule following the collapse of the Carolingian authority. Yet the picture is not entirely straightforward. As I've already explained, the later editions criticize Odo for failing to deal effectively with renewed Viking attacks. So in other words, rather than presenting simple royal propaganda, the Bella may therefore preserve changing political attitudes during Odo's reign. Now, what happens exactly in the poem? The narrative begins when a Viking fleet sails up the Seine, intending to pass Paris and raid further inland. The city's bishop, called Godman, refuses them permission to sail further upstream. And it is after this that the Vikings respond by attacking. Just to name some of its content, Abbo describes repeated assaults on the city's towers, desperate repairs carried out overnight, fierce fighting on the bridges, miraculous interventions by Saint-Germain, negotiations between Frankish leaders and Viking commanders, and the arrival of Emperor Charles V. At the end of the narrative, so after the seemingly successful defense of Paris, Charles V eventually agrees to pay the Vikings and allows them to continue their campaign elsewhere. After the death of Charles V, Odo becomes king in 888, and the poem concludes by describing the political struggles that followed. Now, why is this source, the Bella, so important? Unlike many medieval writers, Abbo witnessed the siege, or at least a great deal of the siege himself. His account provides remarkable detail about Viking tactics, Frankish military organization, siege warfare, diplomacy, morale, religious belief. At the same time, as I've already established, it's not an objective military report. Abbo was writing as a monk, as a Parisian, and as a supporter of the city's defenders. He admired Odo, he celebrated miracles, and interpreted the conflict through a deeply Christian worldview. That said, still the text can be used to deduce certain facts about the Vikings during this period, albeit critically. For historians, the Bella is therefore invaluable. It may tell us some facts about Vikings during this period in time, but most of all, it shows how contemporaries, in this case Abbo, understood one of the most famous Viking attacks of the 9th century. In conclusion, the Bella is far more than just a poem about a Viking siege. It is an eyewitness account, a work of political commentary, and it remains one of the richest narrative sources for the siege of Paris and for the world in which Vikings and Franks confronted and interacted with each other. However, as we have seen, it must be read critically, not only for the events it records, but also for the values, assumptions, and political messages that shape its story. Thank you all once again for watching. Take care and see you in the next one.